Anytime you talk about coral degradation, you kind of classify the stressors into global and local stressors. So globally, obviously, we have a lot of problems with climate change. The oceans are getting warmer, they're getting more acidic, and these are things that are impacting corals, not just in Florida, but around the world. Specifically to Florida, we have some of those local stressors, which are things like pollution that leads to algae blooms that can destroy a coral reef. We also have a lot of problems with overfishing and the removal of really key apex predators that keep a coral system in check. In the Florida Keys specifically, we've had problems with disease outbreaks historically throughout the 80s and 90s, and also now we're seeing them pop up again as well. So there are a lot of different problems that corals are facing, and they're not just limited to big global stressors, nor are they just limited to local environmental issues.
The most major threat at this point is temperature increase. So as sea surface temperatures rise, coral bleaching events are becoming more and more common.
The main one is increasing the prevalence of coral bleaching events. So with warmer water temperatures, we have longer periods where the coral is above its temperature threshold, essentially. The longer it's above that threshold, the more likely it will bleach, and the longer it'll stay bleached, the more likely the coral will die. Because of this ocean warming, temperatures are staying higher than they have ever before for longer periods of time. It's creating more stress on the coral. The second effect is what's called ocean acidification. And this has to do with actually the carbon in our atmosphere dissolving directly into the ocean and being incorporated into chemicals in the ocean. So it's mixing with the water and with calcium and carbonate in the ocean, and it's essentially increasing the acidity. It's lowering the pH of our ocean, and the corals need a very specific environment to be able to secrete their skeleton and to be able to create the reef, the limestone, the calcium carbonate that is the home of all these organisms. And if the pH is too low, it can't actually secrete that reef. And then the third one is a global weather effect that climate change is having. It's increasing the intensity of these large-scale storm events we have. And it's not only increasing the intensity, but it's increasing the frequency of these hurricanes, northeastern storms, monsoons. All of these large circular cyclone events are becoming more and more serious. And the stronger they are, the more impact they have on the reefs. Aside from that, we also have just physical damage, whether that's from boat groundings or people dropping their anchors on the reef to just snorkelers sort of swimming around and grabbing coral or kicking coral. So all of that kind of physical damage. And then we also have a problem with disease.
Another major problem, especially here in the Florida Reef Tract, is this new stony coral tissue loss disease. And it's devastating to the point where it's not just a slow tissue death, it can actually cause large coral heads to lose all of their tissue within a 2-3 day period.
So the Acropora corals, the branching corals, are the two species that CRF primarily works with, although we are now also expanding our repertoire to include bouldering corals, the Orbicella genus particularly. And when we go and outplant these corals, we're not trying to bring back corals for the sake of corals. We're trying to bring back an entire ecosystem. But the basis of that ecosystem is the coral. If you don't have the coral, you don't have the invertebrates, you don't have the fish, you don't have the big migratory pelagics coming to the reef anymore. So the coral is where it all starts. But it's not just about bringing back a little colonial invertebrate, right? It's about bringing back an entire ecosystem that then has a lot of ecosystem services, both for the natural world and for us as humans that live in close proximity to the reef.
And corals are a very valuable habitat. They are way less than 1% of the bottom of the ocean. However, they're responsible for 25 to 50% of the world's fisheries. So if we lost our coral reefs, it wouldn't be just some nice, beautiful corals for a tourist, but we would lose the amount of corals that could make half the fisheries available. So those who like seafood should pay attention. And those who like to be a tourist should also pay attention. There's over 70,000 jobs directly related to the health of the coral reef in South Florida. So that's roughly a $5 billion industry that people are coming to enjoy all of the ecological benefits and views of a reef. So now, like forestry, we're not surprised when somebody says I can rebuild a forest by planting trees, or I can now put plugs of mangrove seedlings out into an area. We can now do the underwater forest the same way. And hopefully it's a game changer for the better. Because if we lose our few species of hard corals, we'll lose actually hundreds of species of all the invertebrates and vertebrates that make that their ecological home required to exist.
The coral itself is actually an animal. It is a colonial animal that, if you look here, it's got a bunch of what we call polyps, and every polyp is a genetically identical individual than its neighbor next to it. So this whole colony, as we call it, this piece of coral, will be anywhere from 100 to thousands of individual polyps. And that itself is the animal. They're connected by various tissues, they share nutrients, they share energy.
Corals are actually incredible organisms because they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. The asexual process is called fragmentation, and it's what we actually take advantage of in our nursery setting. So when we go to a coral tree, we can actually cut a coral in half and create two separate colonies that will then continue to grow as healthy individuals. They also reproduce sexually through a once-a-year spawning event, a mass spawning event where all individuals from a species in an area will release their gametes simultaneously over the course of a couple nights. And from this sexual spawning event, we can get new genetic recombination and new genotypes, new genetic strains of coral populating the reef. So it's a way for the corals to keep up with evolution and develop new characteristics that will best let them adapt and survive in their environment.
And we've lost about 95, if not more, % of our staghorn and elkhorn corals. So those are our two acroporid species that we have in the Florida Keys, and they're the main reef building species, or they were the main reef building species. And so that's why we're focusing on restoring those two species, as well as now incorporating two other species of boulder corals. Essentially, we are gardeners working with an animal and not a plant this time. With the principles of restoration, of coral restoration, have come from silviculture, which is essentially forest restoration, forestry. So we've adapted those principles on land that they've perfected for 100 years, and we've brought them into what we call in situ, in the water, in our nurseries. 3 miles offshore, we have an 1.5 acre area of land where we have about 500 of these trees, and that's just one of our nurseries. We have 4 or more nurseries all throughout the Florida Keys. And so essentially we're bringing wild populations of these corals. So we'll take a tiny little fragment, maybe about that big, from a natural population, and we try to collect as many genetically distinct variants of this species, of all of our species, as possible. That way we have, we encompass as much genetic diversity within our nursery as we can, and then we incorporate as much genetic diversity within our outplant program as we can. So once we've got the coral in our nursery, we hang them on this coral tree, which has been developed by the Coral Restoration Foundation. There are some modified versions based on our different species. Obviously these corals, the branching species, we hang from monofilament on the trees. Some of the other corals, the massive corals, we actually sit facing upright because they like to be upright with the direct sunlight. So it just depends on the species, but it's a very sort of universal design that can be modified for pretty much any species of coral. They're growing on the tree. We'll probably let a fragment grow for anywhere from 6 months to a year. A fragment that's maybe a little bit larger than a finger can grow into a cantaloupe or basketball-sized area within a year. From there, we can then what we call fragment that coral. We can cut it up into a bunch of different pieces. You'll probably get maybe 3 outplant-sized corals from one big fragment. And then we then take those corals and outplant them onto the reef using a 2-part marine epoxy. It's a putty like a cement glue. We clear a little bit of area on the reef. Each coral gets 3 points of attachment for redundancy. In case one point fails, we've got 2 more, and it gives it a really solid, firm grip on the reef. And from there, the epoxy hardens in about 45 minutes, and the coral is cemented onto the reef. In about a month, it'll grow over the epoxy, what we call skirting. It'll skirt tissue onto the reef, and then it'll actually start holding fast itself onto the reef.
Now, growing coral sounds like it's from outer space type of an idea, but it's been being developed over the past 5 to 10 years. Some in the field, meaning underwater with the fast-growing branching corals, which like staghorn corals, which breaks easy and can regrow very fast. But the majority of corals have been the large, massive ones that actually build the reef and build the land that we're actually living on and protect the shorelines from wave actions. And those have never been grown before until now, and recently we've learned a way to break them into tiny pieces using a specialized saw that is meant for making coral jewelry. And with that saw, we can cut pieces of corals into the size of just the head of a pin, as little as 1 or 2 coral polyps, produce then many large numbers of corals, and for some reason it induces them to grow very fast. Now, most people know that corals grow usually very slowly. A coral the size of a medium-sized pizza, that head would be about 75 to maybe 100 years old. So who would want to run an operation where we'd have to wait for 3 generations till it grew up? But we can take a coral now, the size of maybe a golf ball, and cut it into 50 to 100 microfragments. So we get a large number of new pieces, and they are stimulated to grow back to that size in as little as 6 months. And so we can, in a half a year, produce in one of these tanks about 1,000 corals and are ready to plant them out.
We think the reaction that the coral has to being cut is the same reaction that our skin has to being cut. So when we cut ourselves, our skin goes into overdrive to scab over, create new skin, but it doesn't grow like that all the time. It grows new skin in reaction to being hurt or cut. We think the coral has that same reaction because when we cut it, it grows 40 times faster than it does in the wild. So we can go from this small 1 centimeter size piece to covering the entire head of the plug in about 4 to 8 months, depending on the species, when it would normally take 5 to 25 years to get to be this size naturally in the wild.
We keep track of each of the fragments, now called microfragments, and we tag them. So from every one parent colony that we might get 20, 50, or 100 microfragments, we tag them as being clones. And we track them and plant them back on the reef next to each other. So we'll find possibly a coral head this big that has been dead for 5 or 10 years, and we will plant 10 or 20 of those microfragments of the same clone a few inches apart. What it ends up looking like is something like a pepperoni pizza, except the live corals, showing as dark like the pepperoni slices, will grow together, touch each other, and they will re-recognize each other that they came from the same parental clone. And so they don't fight like corals usually do. They will merge and meld back together. They will fuse back together as a coral head within 2 to 3 years that would have taken 50 to 100 years to grow. And that sounds pretty outrageous, and it is, but it's a game changer for the coral world. And it gives us hope that we can actually use technology now to help corals.
You're going to cut all the way around the edge. That way you would assure that each fragment has 4 cut sides instead of 3. And once you've cut all the way around the edge, you'll cut it into strips of the correct thickness. We try and cut our frags to be 1 square centimeter. We try and get, for these species with lots of small polyps, we try and get at least 3 to 4 full-size polyps. With our other species, we try and get between 1 and 3 full polyps. So with regards to outplanting, generally speaking, what we do is we outplant our corals in arrays of 5. So that means we have 5 full-sized plugs of one particular genotype or individual. And that way, when they grow out and start touching each other, they'll fuse rather than fight. So what we'll do is we'll outplant these arrays of 5 along a reef crest. That way they won't get covered by sediment, and they'll be in a good flow area, not a dead zone where a lot of sand will collect.
As for the actual outplant process, we are outplanting these corals in what we call clusters. And so each cluster that we plant has 10 fragments within the cluster, and they're all monogenetic clusters. So each of those 10 corals will be the same genotype from the same tree, essentially. Maybe not from the same colony, but from the same tree. And so the idea is that we plant 10 of these corals in a cluster very close together. Within about a year, they'll start to grow up and actually fuse together, as long as they're the same genotype. It's the same animal, it's gonna grow into itself, essentially, and then just keep growing past that. So we have these 10 clusters, and they create a thicket, basically. And when we're planting on the reef, we plant a cluster here, and then a meter over, we plant a cluster of a different genotype. And essentially that is how we're trying to get them to spawn and meet each other, is we're putting these genetically distinct clusters of 10 corals in close proximity to each other on the reef. We've now started to branch out, pun intended, into non-branching coral species. So what we call massive corals or bouldering corals, specifically the Orbicella genus, we're now actively propagating, growing, and outplanting 2 species, Orbicella fabulata and Orbicella annularis. This is greater star coral and the lobed star coral.
What we're going to see today is the world's largest offshore coral nursery, which contains about 500 of these trees, and each one of the trees holds endangered species of coral. So what we'll be doing is actually propagating some of these corals, cutting them in a process we call fragmenting, and then rehanging them so that we maintain our nursery stock. But then we're also going to collect some of them that are ready for the reef, and we'll take them out to a local reef site and we'll plant them.
We will clear the reef with the back of a hammer and then put the corals down with our 2-part marine epoxy. And then basically it's set to go. Like I said, we'll plant them in the clusters of 10. And then what we'll probably do at the end is actually take a photo mosaic of the corals that we just planted. So we have a camera rig that will swim over those corals, get a bunch of images, 100, 200, 300 plus photos, and then come back in with those photos, stitch them, and we have a good view of that area we just restored and what those clusters, what those corals look like.
There are a lot of different ways that you can determine if your restoration effort is successful. At CRF, we tend to define success by how many corals are alive at certain time periods after an outplanting event. So at CRF, we monitor our corals 1 month after the outplanting, and then again 9 to 12 months after outplanting. And all we're doing is counting how many of the corals are still alive at these time periods and figuring out what their survival rate is.
For the most part, in general, we do a 1-month monitoring, a 6-month monitoring, and then a year monitoring for the following years. And what we're looking for is mortality, predation, smothering by sand. So we're just trying to find out where's the best place.
As the organization has grown from one that planted maybe 100 corals in a year to now one that plants 25,000 corals in a year, we've not only had to upscale the outplanting, we've had to upscale the monitoring as well. And so this means looking for more efficient ways to monitor corals beyond just throwing divers in the water with a paper and pencil and having them count 25,000 corals. You can't do it, there's not enough time. So what we're doing now is actually utilizing photomosaic technology, where we have divers swim with camera rigs and actually photograph the reef, then stitch those images together to create a large-scale image of the reef restoration area, and then monitor and analyze that large photograph for the exact same metrics that we had been doing with in-water surveys before. So it's a way to really cut down on in-water monitoring time, but still get the exact same metrics that we've been taking in the past. And from there, we can define success by not just how many corals are alive, but how much are they growing? How quickly are they growing? How much of the bottom area are they covering? Are they breaking and reattaching in different places? Are they even spawning and recruiting new baby corals to that same area? These are things that you can't do with single time point in-water diver surveys, but we can do it now.
There are a lot of ways to get involved in coral restoration, but also just marine conservation in general.
Volunteers play a critical role in the success of an organization like CRF. We are a very small staff here, and yet we're taking on a monumental challenge. So the work that we do could not be accomplished if we weren't pulling in help from local volunteers, people from around the country that come and visit and maybe only work with us for a day or two.
So you can volunteer your time, you can volunteer your money. There's a lot of ways that CRF allows volunteers to get really hands-on. come and volunteer on our boats as working divers. Really get your hands dirty in the nursery cleaning, on the reefs outplanting, everything from doing monitoring dives with our science team to coming out with the restoration program.
Volunteers have opportunities to work not only in the water with us, but also on land. I think that's something a lot of people don't know. The volunteers can come dive with us on our boats if they so choose, but they can also work in our warehouse, making restoration supplies that we're going to use in our outplanting efforts, for example. So there's so many ways to get involved, whether you're a diver, whether you're someone that just cares about marine conservation or coral reefs and you want to come down and visit for a little bit. Doesn't matter if you're a local and you've lived in the Keys for 30 years or you're someone from the upper Midwest like me, who cares passionately about our oceans and just wants to get involved somehow. There are always ways that people can get involved.
So things that you can do to help the reef at this time is you can take part in Bleach Watch, which is where you, if you find a coral reef where there is bleaching of corals, you can report them. You can also, whenever you go out to enjoy the reef, look, don't touch. Even us as scientists, we don't want to touch we only touch the corals in lab because we know that they're being kept in a pristine environment where they'll recover. Out in the wild, they're going to have a harder time recovering, so never touch a coral out in the wild.
Within your everyday life, there's also a lot of things that as individuals you can do, as a family you can do, that affect the reefs, that affect marine conservation, that affect global climate change. Things like eating less meat, things like reducing your gas consumption, carpooling to work, biking to work, depending on your situation and circumstance. Eating sustainable seafood. There's a lot of resources that are being put out now to direct people towards what is sustainable, to making better life choices, reducing your plastic use, reducing your use of styrofoam, bringing glass take-home containers when you go out to eat, that kind of thing. Using less plastic cups, having a reusable water bottle is all something very simple and very easy that actually goes a really long way in helping to not only protect the reefs, but protect the marine environment and the earth as a whole.
One of the important things to realize about coral reefs and coral reef conservation is that it's part of an interconnected natural system. So even if you don't live in the Florida Keys or you can't make it to the Florida Keys, there are still ways that you can impact coral reefs and thereby the conservation of coral reefs. So you can start volunteering with conservation nonprofits in your own area. Everything is connected, so making a difference in any one of these different ecosystems that Florida has will make a difference ultimately for our coral reefs. On the political side of things, you can get involved locally or at the state level in politics. Advocate for policies that will help improve the environment. Again, whether that's directly impacting coral reefs or maybe just something locally in your environment, in your area. Everything comes back to this interconnectedness of the system. So no matter what you're doing, as long as it's a positive difference for the natural environment, it will ultimately be a benefit for coral reefs. Anyone can get involved with this kind of thing. You don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to be a young person, an old person. You don't need to live on the coast. You don't even need to live in Florida. Anyone, anywhere can make a difference. Maybe you have a chance to come down and volunteer at an organization like this, where you can actually make a hands-on impact for an endangered species like a coral. Whatever it is, there are always ways to get involved, and the only way that we're going to solve a problem as huge and monumental as the decline of coral reefs is if everyone just does a little bit.